problem of economic inequality and of the distribution of income was one that preoccupied the most important figures in the history of economics, from Adam Smith, David Ricardo, Karl Marx, down into the 20th century. But it was one that over the initial decades following the Second World War had substantially receded from view. It was a topic which appeared to be, to have lost its importance in a world where, partly in consequence of the social progress made during the New Deal, partly in consequence of the major social changes that were brought to the United States in the course of the Second World War, and the relative stability of those first decades after the war, seemed to have no longer be the most important, the most critical topic. This was an age of stable and allegedly sustainable economic growth, during which the share between labor and capital, between wages and profits, and across the spectrum of personal incomes not only seemed to be stable, but actually was stable, if not actually improving, in the sense that over time the society appeared to be becoming more and more equal, more and more egalitarian. And by the time I came along into graduate school in the 1970s, there basically was no longer any real study of the subject. My professors would say things, like studying inequalities like watching the grass grow. Nothing ever happened, so why bother? As you can imagine, in an early instance of the maxim that Sandra just repeated, that the economics is a gentleman's club that always gets things wrong, just as they had come to this view, things started to change. And the period after the middle 1970s brought a recognition of something quite different going on. And this especially accelerated in the 1980s. And it became clear that, in fact, we were not in a permanent state of the stability, of distributional stability, of stability between wages and profits, of stability in the structure of pay and incomes, but that, in fact, we were in the middle of what two labor economists at the time, Barry Bluestone and Bennett Harrison, called a great U-turn, in which, after having seen inequality decline for a long time, we were now seeing it rise, and rise rather sharply. And this was something about which a great many people were instinctively concerned, by which they were troubled. And so the question came up, was there an explanation for this phenomenon? Quite early on, I would say by the early 1990s, the leading voices in the economics profession had advanced very clear-cut and forcefully articulated hypotheses about this, ideas about what was going on in the structure of wages that was causing inequality to rise. And they had at least narrowed it down to 2 or 3 major poles of debate, of which the leading proposition, the one that had the most purchase with the prominent economists, that was, for example, prominently featured in a major article in the American Economic Review, was that the responsible force for rising inequality was a change in the nature of technology and the way in which technology affected the workforce. And in particular, that what was going on was that advances in technology were increasing the need that businesses had for highly skilled workers and causing them to raise the pay of the highly skilled, highly educated workers, necessarily relatively few in number, in comparison to the pay of everybody else who was not highly skilled or highly educated. And that the gap that was being observed was therefore a function of this process of supply and demand, or really relative supply and relative demand, in a whole plethora of labor markets around the country, and by extension around the world. And that was a major, and still is, a major hypothesis. It has a name in the economic literature that every economist, every labor economist knows very well. They call it skill-biased technological change. And it dovetails quite well with an existing body of economic theory. And there was a second line of argument that was offered by other economists, mostly many economists associated with the labor movement, many economists who were concerned with international trade, who were observant of, for example, the provisions of the NAFTA that went into effect in the middle 1990s, and who thought that the same phenomenon could be explained better, at least equally well, and maybe better, by the expansion of world trade, and particularly in manufacturing, and by outsourcing what came to be called globalization. And the idea here was that if you open your borders to manufacturing trade with countries whose labor is paid much less than it is here, then they will undermine wage standards, at least in manufacturing and maybe over the whole spectrum of labor markets, because they're effectively increasing the supply of unskilled labor, and so pressing down wages. And these were the two stories. I was invited to look into this at the time that this debate was most vivid in the mid-1990s by a foundation in New York, a center-left foundation called, at the time, the 20th Century Fund, now called the Century Foundation. So I undertook, with the help of, we were just beginning a PhD program at the LBJ School, with the help of a few of the early students, to begin, first of all, to survey the studies that had been made on this, and to look at what actually they were based on. And the thing that struck me was that the foundation of evidence was very thin. It's very sparse. First of all, there hadn't been a lot of studies, and what there had been tended to be, let's say, a survey taken in 1 year in the early 1980s and then something taken much later, or maybe the late 1970s, in the late 1980s, and a comparison of the two, into which you could read support for one proposition or the other. And there was a contest over what the evidence, which of these two alternative propositions the evidence more strongly backed. Most of this information was about the United States, as you might expect, the country where there are the most economists, the country where there is the richest source of this kind of surveys. But there was very little out there that enabled one to say anything concretely about what was going on in the world as a whole. And my view was that I could not make a useful contribution to this discussion unless I was able to bring new information to bear. And the question was there any way to come up with measures of economic inequality which other people didn't have? And the answer to that, surprisingly, turned out to be yes. And the reason is the following. The tradition of labor economics is one which has become, particularly in applied work, strongly focused on and reliant on surveys of people. Right? When we have these, and they are built into, there are lots of private surveys, but also lots of public governmental surveys. The Bureau of Labor Statistics does them on a regular basis, and you get lots and lots of information about what's going on to, say, something called the Current Population Survey, 60,000 or so households on a monthly basis, with the information that is collected by the survey taker. So you know about the age, the ethnicity, whether it's a male or female-headed household, education, lots of different characteristics of those households. But you can't go beyond what's in the surveys, because that information, If it hasn't been surveyed, it isn't there. Okay? And in much of the rest of the world, while surveys have been taken now and then, there are often very long gaps between consecutive surveys, and often the concept of what is being surveyed changes. Sometimes income, sometimes it's expenditure. So when you get a measure of inequality, it's not necessarily measuring the same thing from one period to the next. Well, was there anything else you could do? Well, it turned out that, well, it turns out, it is clear that every country with an orderly functioning government, which some countries don't have, collects a lot of what we'll call administrative data on a routine basis. They collect, for example, the population of every province that they have, or states, the United States, counties and states. And they collect some measures of income from those places. They collect payroll data from establishments, from businesses, and they ask them how many people they employ. Simple information. And they group it up into categories, which may be geographic categories or may be industry categories, and they publish it in tables. And you can get this for lots and lots and lots of places. Well, can you make anything out of it? What we realized is that you could, and we started making calculations which are very simple. Fundamentally calculations that any graduate student can learn in 20 minutes. I used to say, any graduate student except a Russian. Russian only takes 10 minutes. This is mathematics, which actually originated in information theory, so people who are familiar with computer science, and it's exactly related to the original work of Claude Shannon at MIT, and turned into economics by an econometrician at the University of Chicago by the name of Henri Theil. The particular measure is called the Theil statistic. It has lots of nice properties. I won't trouble you with them. We started calculating these things. And for the United States, what we found is that we could calculate them comprehensively, certainly every year. We could, in fact, calculate them for certain parts of the economy every month and get a number measuring inequality, for example, in the pay in manufacturing, which you could match up to the monthly unemployment rate to see how closely they corresponded. So you had a richness in the information set that wasn't there before. And that could tell you when things happened, how big the changes were, and enable you to be a lot more confident about what, in fact, was going on. So that, in essence, is the scope of the project, and what I've been doing ever since. I feel like I run a salt mine in which graduate students are sent down to dig up tile statistics, and they come up. I even get a little notoriety for it. In 2003, I was quoted making some adverse comment about the Iraq War. Can you imagine that? And for this impertinence, William Crystal, who was, at one point, the top aide to Vice President Dan Quayle. A man whose authority on that basis is unimpeachable, said that, quoted me, saying, "This man who makes his living calculating tile statistics," which I'm sure he didn't have the vaguest idea what they are, but it sounded fun for his readership, nevertheless thinks he knows that the Iraq War is going to be a disaster. And I said, yeah, that is my view. It's not based on the same information set, except maybe common sense. We started writing papers and eventually publishing articles and eventually books that dealt with this topic. Early on, we were looking at pay in the United States, which of course was the area that was in dispute in this debate over technology and globalization. And you could measure the inequality in structures of pay directly across industrial sectors. And by dividing them still more finely, you could pretty well establish that what you were measuring was a measure of the whole, of what was actually going on in the whole distribution. And we did this right back to 1920. pulling together different kinds of data. And we found an extraordinarily close association with the unemployment rate. All right? Very simple relationship. Better paid workers tend to be paid salaries. Their pay doesn't vary that much with the state of the economy. Less well-paid workers who are on hourly wage rates have a large variation in their hours and their weekly earnings and in their hourly wage average, because if they're working a lot, they're getting overtime. Right? So there's a lot of things which just led us to believe that this number that we were measuring ought to be related to the state of the economy, and we match it up to the unemployment rate. It's quite close. There are other things which matter. Labor force participation rates matter. The exchange rate matters. The interest rate, minimum wage matter. But you can isolate a handful of major things and basically explain what's going on in that series pretty effectively. And that's to say that in prosperous times, lower paid working people experience the strongest gains. It matters to them. It's important to them that the unemployment rate be below 4%. Because then the labor market is tight, and not only maybe they are working multiple jobs, which I'm not going to pick up in my data, but the jobs, each job that they're working in is going to be paying a little better. Whereas for someone like me, it doesn't matter one way or another. Right? So that was the first finding. But pay is not the only source of income. Right? There's two very separate concepts. One of them is what you get paid for your work, and the other is the income that you report to the Internal Revenue Service on your tax form. Income is a concept which, first of all, you do see it on an individual basis, and you can get very detailed data on the structure of incomes. But as I say, each person's income is a combination of the income they may or may not get from their wages, plus the income they may or may not get from dividends, capital gains, exceptionally favored cases, stock option realizations, things of that nature. So when you do the same calculation for incomes, you get a pattern which is quite different than the pattern for pay. Particularly just to take one period, and I could walk you through a lot of this, but to take one period that's of great interest, the late 1990s, a prosperous period for the working population. Unemployment rate was below 4% for 4 years, 3 or 4 years. The income and pay inequality declines in this period, but income inequality goes up by a lot. And what's going on? What's going on is the major increase in asset prices, feeding into the incomes of a small number of people. Right? And you can isolate this by geographic region, and you discover that if you measure it across counties, 15 counties account for all of it out of 3,150. One of them is near here. Actually, I think this is one of them. Travis is in the top 15 in that period. But the 5 of them account for half of it. And those 5 counties are at the very top: New York, New York, which is Manhattan. 3 counties in Northern California, which are Santa Clara, San Mateo, and San Francisco. And 1 more, which is King County, Washington, which is Seattle. Right? So you can see what's going on there is the enormous concentration of reported incomes in the financial sector and in the tech sector. And of course, it comes to an end in 2000, right? After which that form of inequality declines. And actually the peak in our measures of inequality is actually 2000. People say inequality keeps going up. It's not obvious to me from our measures that that is in fact the case. We have a sawtooth pattern which reflects the fact that the stock market hasn't gone up since the peak. And in some cases, the tech stocks are not where they were. What does this tell you? It tells you that for the last 30 years, which is when this pattern of kind of opposing movements begins to be really visible. We have relied for economic growth in the United States on credit booms. On credit booms, which are invariably followed by busts. Right? Which is why I titled the last book, which kind of spells this out as well as I can, Inequality and Instability. It is not the case that periods of rising income inequality are experienced by Americans as bad times. On the contrary, I think most of us remember the late 1990s as good times. But the problem is that those times don't last. There are moments, you know, when you're at a party and someone says something, and as you're going out the door, going down the elevator, you think of what you should have said in reply, right? I've had that experience with this book. It's the perfect metaphor for what's going on occurred to me after it was published. And that is to say that income inequality is like blood pressure. Right? That is to say that there is a range that you want to be in that's healthy. And that within that range, it's better to be on the low side than on the high side. Right? But, of course, it could be too low. If the number is too low, things get a little sluggish. 0 is a number that you'll find in the morgue, but not elsewhere. Right? And that's true of inequality as well as of blood pressure. And then there is this phenomenon of the increasing measurement, right? The increase. And when the number is going up, it may be symptomless, but it's a sign you're heading for trouble. Right? And there may be a crisis down the road. Right? And it seems to me in all of those respects, the measurements of income inequality that we have developed and measured for a lot of places tend to conform to those basic principles. Let me talk about some issues that go beyond the United States, but that seem to me have a relevance for the way we think about some major economic problems. One of them is the relationship between inequality of pay and employment and unemployment. There is a standing body of doctrine about that in economics. And it's particularly the case in Europe, certainly up until 4 years ago before the crisis, that policy authorities insisted constantly to European workers that the problem they had and the reason why they had a chronically high unemployment rate compared to the US was that they didn't have a flexible labor market, that their wages were rigid. And so flexibilization became a kind of mantra repeated to the point where it became almost heresy, and they were practically unheard of to challenge it. But what does, if you want to compare rigidity and flexibility in labor markets systematically, what does it mean? A flexible labor market is one in which the pay structures are unequal enough so that employers can pay the high-paid workers what they want to pay them and pay the low-skilled workers as little as they want to pay them. Right? The high-skilled workers versus the low-skilled workers. In which case, it ought to be the case that countries which have a lot of inequality would have lower unemployment than countries which have a little bit of inequality, which have basically compressed their pay structures. And that's a testable proposition. And you can calculate these numbers systematically and comparably all across Europe. And you find that as a testable proposition, it is entirely false. The evidence doesn't support it at all. What do you find instead? You find that there are countries in Northern Europe, the Scandinavian countries and Germany, where unemployment is relatively low, systematically, usually, and pay structures are quite compressed, where you have a lot of union coverage, right? And The differentials are not allowed to get very large. They're not zero, but they're not allowed to get that large. And the unemployment rates stay down. Whereas in the south of Europe, in Spain and in Italy, the inequalities are very high, and so are the unemployment rates. And that is a statistically, you can look at it 4 ways to Sunday, and you're not going to change that conclusion. So that suggested that the whole story was wrong. Is there another story that can explain the relationship that you actually find? I think there are two. One of them is that when you have a lot of inequality, particularly across regions, you get a lot of migration. So what happens when, let's say, Franco died in Spain and it became possible to really move around in the country? A lot of people left the countryside because the jobs in the countryside stank and moved to the cities to find a handful of industrial jobs. And since there were only a few of them, much better paid than the jobs in farming, a lot of people milled around and were unemployed, and the Spanish unemployment rate went up to 20%. Okay? And the same in Italy. And the stories are, once you look at them, you see this migration from the south of Italy to the north looking for jobs. It's exactly the same phenomenon. It's very comprehensively clear. Inequality produces migration in search of better jobs, and that is the same thing, essentially, as unemployment. Suppose you have very strong unions, good social welfare programs. What happens? You've held up the bottom of the wage structure, and you've said it is not possible to be a profitable business that relies on really cheap labor, because we're not going to let you pay really low wages. What happens? Those businesses close down. Right? They emigrate. And what then happens, if you do the labor force training correctly, as the Scandinavians did, is you've created a good environment to attract higher productivity business, engineering businesses, for example, heavy manufacturing businesses, which is how the Scandinavian countries rose from being basically average for Europe to being at the top of the world income pile over 70 years, from 1930 to 2000. Okay? And there was, I mean, the Swedish labor union economists at the time understood very well what they were doing. So there are two stories here which coincide with what we observe in the data, which are very different from the standard story. But then there's another question. When you look at, and this may come as a surprise because we are accustomed in this country to thinking of ourselves now as being very unequal and the Europeans as being very egalitarian. So how do you reconcile that with the comparison between Europe and the United States? And the answer is, you've got to take account of what actually has happened in Europe in the last 30 years. What's happened is integration. And what were previously a lot of small separate economies, with names like Denmark, right, have become part of one large integrated continental economy called Europe. And the problem that the Europeans face is that they're much more unequal now than they were then, simply because you have to take account of the difference between Germany and Poland, or the difference between Norway and Spain, which is very large. It's like the difference that used to exist between New York and Mississippi, right? Which we gradually reduced over 70 years thanks to the New Deal. Right? So the story is not as simple as it is made out to be. And once you consider Europe as a whole, it's also not true that it is systematically more equal in pay structures than the US, because of these very large differences between countries which have not been removed. So that's sort of an interesting story. Does it apply elsewhere in the world? Well, you can look around. You can get data. I once had to send one of my students to find a dusty bookshop opposite the State Planning Commission in Beijing to get a document on rice paper, which was the annual yearbook of the State Planning Commission. They've since put it online, but this was back before they did that. And we brought it back and coded it by hand and came up with inequality data for China. Right? And what you discover there? The same process. As the inequality rises between the big cities, Beijing, Shanghai, very prosperous province in Guangdong in the south, and the other parts of the country, what happens? Migration, scores of millions of people, and unemployment as those people mill around, sometimes finding jobs and sometimes not finding them. Exactly the same process that you would see in Europe, and that we did see, of course, in the United States, when large parts of our southern population migrated to the north to get much better wages in the 40s and 50s into the 60s. Okay? So it seems to me what we're doing with this work is to capture in historical data facts about history that we know from experience and common sense to be plausible. And that helps reinforce our confidence that we're on the right track. Well, if you can do Europe and the United States and China, or in Russia and India, why not become ambitious and do the whole world? That was the next thought that we had, and we went scavenging for information sets that would enable us to do this. And we found one. It happened to be produced by the United Nations, by the United Nations Industrial Development Organization in Geneva. And we got it, and we started making these same calculations, which were, again, very simple, although they require a certain amount of care to get them right, but they're not complicated. And enabled us to produce one data set that covers almost all the countries in the world, going back to about 1963, and now it's coming up to about 2004. And then to measure what's going on in inequality in each one of those countries, practically year to year. It's a much bigger data set than the World Bank had when we published it. Much bigger, 4 times, 5 times bigger, in terms of number of observations and continuity of observations. So this is pretty cool. And then the question is, what does it tell you? What it tells you is that there is a common pattern in the world's movement of inequality. It's not the case that each country, there's some exceptions here and there, but it's not the case that each country has its own path. It's the case that overall there's little change in inequality up until 1971. Then there's a period when it declines until 1980. And then there is this huge U-turn, and it goes up for 20 years to 2000 and peaks in 2000, just as it does here. 20 years of rapidly rising inequality with turning points that correspond exactly to the major changes in the way the global financial system was run. 1971, you had the end of the Bretton Woods system, which was a stabilizing mechanism for the world trading system. In 1980, you had the outbreak, 1980-81, you had the outbreak of the debt crisis, vast increases in interest rates. Countries that were vulnerable to that saw huge declines in their incomes and huge increases in their inequality, and that's most countries in the rest of the world. Africa, Latin America, parts of Asia. The exceptions are countries that were not exposed to the banking system. China, India, and Iran, which had just had a revolution. Right? And then, as I said, you have this peak. And in 2000, things change again. Interest rates fall, commodity prices recover, and you start having, and actually we were about the first to discover this, declines in inequality, proving that they don't need to go up indefinitely. And you saw in Latin America a real turnaround, Brazil, Argentina, with the result that poverty rates, and this is now very well established for Brazil and Argentina in particular, poverty rates, deep poverty, declined dramatically over the course of 12 years as a result of policies that produced steady growth, rising minimum wages, and expanding social protections, right? Under the leadership of Lula, Luis Inácio da Silva, and his successor, Dilma Rousseff. Now, will that go on forever? Well, no one can say. Unlikely that anything goes on forever, but it does show you that it remains possible, even in this modern globalized world, for parts of the world to pursue policies that do produce social progress and declining inequality. It also shows you that so long as the world remained tethered to financing emanating from New York and London, and determined heavily by decisions taken in Washington, it was extremely hard for the rest of the world to set its own course and determine its own fate. It became easier when US interest rates went down. Let me come back to the US and just make 3 points in conclusion. One of them about the economic conditions that occurred in the last decade, and the other two about political issues that are related to this work. I said that the peak occurred in 2000 with the peak of the NASDAQ, the peak of the internet boom. I think that's about right. But there was then an increase, a decline in the recession, and an increase again of inequality in 2003, 2004. And you can pick out in the US exactly where the great increases in income were occurring at that time. Where do you suppose? If you had to name one metropolitan area that got richer in that period than all of the rest, and ended up actually as the richest of the metropolitan areas in the United States, which one would it be? What? It's not New York, actually. Washington, D.C. and the area, the counties around it. This was a big government boom fueled by the increase in spending on the military and related activities by the George W. Bush administration. And I've often said in Washington that there was never a case where so many Democrats were so enriched in their property values by the actions of the Republican administration. Right? But you can see what's going on there, and it shows up very clearly in our data. And then that fades a little bit, and there is another peak, which comes to a peak in 2007. And if you look at a map of where the incomes were being generated there, of course, the dominant source is once again New York. And the others, well, you look in Southern California, and you look down the coast of Florida, and you look in Nevada, and you look in Arizona, and you find these hot spots of income generation, which are obviously connected to the mortgage finance scam that was building toward the great bust of 2007 and 2008. Which is just to say that our income inequality measures are really, when you look at them geographically, you look at them by sector, they're very good indicators of where the, not just of instability in general, but of where the instabilities actually are. Okay? Last 2 points are about politics. We looked into the question of how income inequality affects voting patterns. And it's a very interesting problem which you can analyze in the United States in very interesting ways because we have all of these states. And who wins the state determines who wins the Electoral College and therefore who wins the presidency. And there are 2 points that stood out. One is states which were more unequal tended to have lower voting turnouts. Okay? Why are you not surprised? Oh, because you live in the South, as I do. Right? So there's a very clear evidence for this in places where you have a lot of difference between the high and the low in the income distribution. It's probably not in the interest of the wealthiest people in the community that the very numerous poorer people should be voting. Right? And they do all kinds of things to discourage it. I'm sure that all of you have much more experience than I do with the practicality of that. Second thing was, perhaps, if possible, even more interesting. This is a question was, does it matter, does inequality affect the way the elections turn out? And actually, if you look at a measure of how unequal the population of a state is, you don't find it. But we tried something else, basically because I had a hunch based upon the way the maps looked. We tried measuring the extent to which rich people were actually separated from poor people where they live. And here you have a real difference across the country. Some states, you have wealthy counties and relatively poor counties, and they're quite geographically distinct. And in other states, they're not. Right? And here's how it turned out. In the states which we called polarized, practically all of them vote Democratic. In the states where the rich and the poor live side by side, that's where you have the Republican lock on the Electoral College. That's the South and the Plains. The states which are deep blue are places like California, New York, Massachusetts, Connecticut. And I went to graduate school in Connecticut, you know the place. It's a patchwork of rich towns and working class towns, of the Stanfords and the Bridgeports. And what's going on? Well, the hypothesis that we have is that so long as these two communities are a little bit distinct, particularly on local issues, it's much easier for them to be allied on national issues. All right? Much easier for, in other words, for very rich people not to be as aggressively Republican as they are say, around here. I closed the article in which we presented that result with the observation that it is simply reinforced something that we all know, which is that familiarity breeds contempt. In any event, what I'm saying about this is, I guess, that I think we accomplished something here with a very small group of students with essentially no budget. Just a little bit of ingenuity using readily available data sets to map out a lot of things in the world that were previously just a little bit more obscure than they have become as a result of this work. So I'm once again very happy to be here to have a chance to talk to you a little bit about it. Thanks very much.